Chair, Ingrid, Eddie, when I heard those numbers, Eddie, my wife keeps on telling me, do you know the story that when you offered me that job many years ago? Yeah? Twice you offered me that job, by the way. And I didn't take it. My wife said to me, aren't you the poor boy today didn't head off with Eddie O'Connor? So Eddie, I learnt that lesson many years ago when you were doing, I didn't believe in wind energy and I wasn't a believer back then, but now actually solar is coming to where wind was when you started, right? So that's exactly why I've started the solar business. So Joe, thank you very much indeed for having me here. I'm to talk about 50 Shades of Grey, I'm actually a virgin at the MacGill summer school. So go easy. I started my working life actually in ESB in 1989. Actually, I think, Eddie, you were, head of fuel purchasing at that stage, back in 1989. And I had the pleasure of working at senior level, both at ESB and also clearly in Bord Gáis. But when I think back to 1989, when I started as a graduate engineer at 21, ESB dictated a national electricity agenda. Bord Gáis dictated a national gas agenda. There was no regulator. The government controlled all energy tariffs. Climate change consisted, Ingrid, just before you came on, of a nightly weather report. There were few renewables, some small wind and solar. No electrical connection with Britain. No gas connection with Britain. Apple was producing Apple Macs, if you remember those small little machines. And Google, Facebook, Amazon and the Internet did not exist. None of us had mobile phones. The European Union did not dictate European energy policy or Irish energy policy in 1989. But Ireland in 2015 actually is extremely different. The European Union is the prime deliverer of policy in energy in Europe, but we have to implement it in our own way. Climate change is a universal reality. As Ban Ki-moon said when he came here recently to take a prize in Tipperary, Ireland must do more. We have 3 energy regulators with 1 chairman. ESB and Bord Gáis are only participants in a broader market where you have Centrica, Veu, Energia, Airgrid and others. Renewables now in many ways dominate actual electricity investment at this time. We have 4 interconnectors with Britain, but I actually agree with Eddie, we need more. We need an interconnector to France as well from an electricity point of view and other supergrid connectors right across Europe. The gas market, and I say this as being the former chief of the company, has particularly hit its peak. It is on a very, very swift decline as a company. I know Michael McNicholas was here yesterday. He may have commented on that very same issue. Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, as Eddie said, all have renewable plans and insist on 100% supply from green sources. In fact, renewable energy is now becoming, I spoke to the IDA the other week, is now becoming a siting requirement for the IDA for companies from the United States and from other parts of the world. I've had the envious experience of developing conventional and renewable energy right across the world, and I now lead a group of professionals, French, British and Irish, working in France, UK and in Ireland in solar energy. I'll talk about France a second. France is one of the largest nuclear installation or capacities in the world. It actually has in many ways invented that technology from the 60s and the 70s. What are they doing now? They're closing it down. They're moving from 75% penetration to 50% penetration. What are they replacing it with? Renewables. Wind, which is not as good in France, but solar is not that bad. So when I travel around between Avignon and Bordeaux, visiting different rugby clubs and having some red and white wine, it's very, very different to going up to the top of Gweedore or Barnesmore Gap or Kilgarvan. And Eddie would sympathise with this. In midst of winter, looking at a construction site, France is actually doubling, as part of their energy transition law, their auctioned renewables every year in the country that actually has probably the least carbon emissions from its electricity sector because of its nuclear domination. The truth is that France actually is at 8% of the primary energy. If Ireland and France, who are both at 8%, were playing in the Premiership, we'd be playing in the Championship on August 10th. Reality is we are, I think, number 4 and number 3 from the bottom in terms of our targets by 2020. But energy demand is actually growing once again. Our import dependence at this stage is 89%. Think about that in terms of the balance of trade. €6 billion a year is going abroad, when we could actually be keeping that at home, creating jobs, etc. And we're at a time when oil prices, by the way, in 2006, were at $60 a barrel. They peaked at $145 a barrel on July 11th. That's this time in 2008, and we're now at about $51 a barrel. But you know what happened between US dollar and euro? You can very quickly get hit at the fuel pumps by actually a dollar exchange rate and an apparent devaluation of the euro. This is a commodity, and gas is correlated to oil, that we actually have no control over its price as a small country. And we continue to take a view that this energy is always going to be cheaper than alternatives. I don't agree with that. We have spent 15 years trying to get Corrib online. I think it's about to come online at this particular point in time. It's not the best example of infrastructure planning in this country. But the pricing of gas at Corrib, even though it's indigenous to this country, is going to be set at an international price. Not an Irish balancing point price, but along lines of international prices. So we are always going to be a price taker in fossil fuels, when we have the opportunity to be a long-term price maker in renewables and alternatives. Our renewable energy target is 16% of primary sources, but we are currently at 8%, as I said. We have 5 years left to meet 16%. We can't do that without a ground-changing and radical white paper which will accelerate all forms of renewable technologies. Electricity generated from renewables hit 20.9% of consumption in 2013. This is actually one of the best performances in Europe, but actually, when it comes to heat and transport, we're at best dire in our performance so far. From a renewable energy supply perspective, we're a two-trick pony in the country: wind and some bioenergy. We need to have some solar. We need a net metering capability. Oisin, I absolutely agree with that. From an auto production point of view, we need to make sure that rooftops can actually produce electricity and put them into the ESB network. Excuse me. In the perfect economic world in which some renowned Irish commentators live, including Colin McCarthy, there are no targets set by Europe. Climate change is a fad, and Ireland will not be fined when we reach 2020. Well, if you assume that in your thesis, then you are right to say that we should not invest in renewables, nor should we actually continue to support the peat industry as we have for decades. The reality is that climate change is a scientific fact. Our targets are binding, and our annual fines based on internal government reports could be as high as €500 million per annum. The level of subsidy for PSO at this point in time is €83 million. The total value of the electricity market is close to €5 billion. The number in your bill every year is €40, and we're creating jobs, paying taxes, and providing a geopolitical hedge against international commodity prices. We have avoided, since the onset of Eddie and people like myself and others, we've avoided €240 million of imported fuels. I would contend that this recent commentary, by the way, has led to a campaign at government to place a retrospective tax on wind farms, one which actually will raise the rate of municipal rates unseen across Europe threefold, to a value of 21,000 per megawatt. Look what happened in Spain when there was retrospective work done on tariffs on renewables. Eddie would be very familiar with this. You looked at La Tarifa for many years, Eddie. It actually ruined the investment in Spain. I've been involved in wind development myself, set up the business in Borgosh. It is regrettable what happened in the Midlands. I do think that the wind industry, we didn't handle it properly, but also we weren't helped by the body politic. We're in the absence of a real indigenous view in terms of what we have to do with respect to indigenous requirements, indigenous wind. We could have handled this better. Now, in many ways, the damage is done, but we now actually need to get a brand new approach in terms of actually how we're going to address, as Eddie and Oisin have said, how we can actually harness the actual raw resources that we have in plentiful in this country. This is why we need to add supplemental technologies as well, such as solar PV, a bit more biomass, and now actually we will see, one would hope in the future, offshore wind, and also tidal and wave coming to the fore. But it comes back to why I actually resigned or retired or whatever I did in Borgosh back in 2012 as a very old 44-year-old. I said that solar PV was the next most effective solution worldwide on our planet. It is cheaper, it's going to be cheaper than all other forms of energy as we go forward. There is an exponential decrease in modules, as has been commented already, and equipment over the last 5 years. In fact, solar PV is the #1 new source of power worldwide at this time with 40,000 megawatts. That's 4 times Ireland's capacity being installed worldwide. In China alone, 10,000 megawatts of electricity from solar PV is being installed annually. That's equivalent to the totality of what we have installed on this island since 1927. That is some statistic. Why are the Chinese doing this? They're doing it because they believe in independence of China in energy terms. But we still have a view that we should still have 90% of our energy non-independent. China could very well buy credits across the world if it needed to, but it chooses to actually manufacture solar and wind farms and actually install these renewables at enormous rates in China. In Amarenco, we expect to build over €150 million worth of ground-mounted and rooftop solar in Ireland over the next 3 years. But I need a policy. I need people to say, I want it on people's roofs. I disagree with Oisin. I can tell you if you come to France with me, I'll show you the most best protected sheep and calves underneath solar panels in France. They blend in beautifully in the environment. In many cases, you can't even see them behind hedgerows. They are fantastic means by which that you can actually create energy on a long-term basis. These panels can last 40 years. Why do we know that? Well, the International Space Station would have a problem, and the people inside of it would have a problem if that technology was not secure. And I'm very glad to say, last week we had 3 rooftop, in the public service, 3 rooftop tenders went out from various organisations, including universities and councils. We will see an enormous rollout of rooftop and ground-mounted solar in this country over the next 5 to 7 years. It is, as an industry, where Eddie was in 1997, 1998. It is going to be an enormous business that's going to provide taxes, but more importantly, it's going to provide jobs. The truth is that we have no silver bullet for Ireland's energy crisis. We need all of the above technologies, both on the supply side, but also on the demand side. We need to have a vision which is ambitious. And it's interesting that you mentioned T.K. Whitaker, because it's in my speech as well. We need a T.K. Whitaker moment. We have to understand, as a country, a young country, exactly what we want to be from an energy perspective when we grow up. Do we want to be dependent on other parents, or do we want to be independent of our parents, that is, the parents of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc.? It's a fantastic opportunity in our white paper, firstly to hit our targets, but actually to succeed on our targets and set a new vision for Ireland to actually make sure that we, for once and for all, use the full maximum of all of the indigenous resources to provide our energy results. There is a concept, and going back to the energy citizen, of being a consumer and a prosumer. With technology today, from my phone, I can turn on the heating in Dublin. In fact, I was in San Francisco last year. My wife was in bed in the middle of winter time. Of course, she wanted to be hot when she got up in the morning, so I decided, using a Kleinbolt device, to turn off the heating and see what reaction we got. I got a phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning to say, Jesus, John, and she's from Cork, right? Jesus, John, the heating is not working. I said I was just testing it from San Francisco. But that's exactly what technology enables us to do. On the supply side, we clearly need to complement our wind rollout with solar PV and biomass. We do not need to go to offshore wind immediately, but we will need to do so by 2030, and we'll also have to have tidal and wave. Nuclear, I know this is a topical issue, nuclear, in my view, but may be shared by others in the room, is not an option for Ireland. In fact, nuclear is actually more expensive than most renewable technologies at this point in time. The price for Hinkley Point is £91 a megawatt hour, which is equivalent to about 13 cents a unit. I can produce solar in Cork for about 12.5 cents a unit. Eddie can produce wind in Ireland for between 6 and 7. He'll probably tell me it's 4 to 5, but about 6 and 7 is probably the number, cents per unit. And also, the size of a nuclear unit needs to be extremely large. Our country is too small to take a large-scale nuclear unit. All forms of microgeneration and distributed generation need to be fully enabled by ESB networks before it is imposed upon them. Because the world of technology is saying that the consumer can decide what it wants rather than a utility forcing a consumer to take what it wants the consumer to take. On the demand side, obligations for demand reductions must become increasingly compulsory for utilities. This will enable new technologies to be monetised on the basis of energy credits gained by the utilities for installation of devices like Hive, Nest, Climate, etc. As Chairman of the International Sustainability Investment Centre, which is formerly the Green IFSC, I can gladly tell you that 600 of our members are now investing in smart heating, smart lighting, heat pumps, controls, renewables, renewable purchases right across this country that are actually now fundamentally getting us away from the subsidy from government to direct engagement, as Eddie has said, between industry and actual renewable generators and actual clean tech providers in our market. And my final comment would be this. You will forever create very few jobs by buying oil from the Saudis. Thank you very much indeed.